We are on hiatus at the special report, and we are revisiting some of our favorite shows. This week is Civil Rights Icons. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the shows.
Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Areva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. To kick off this morning's broadcast, do me a favor. Please share the show with your online friends or start a viewing party. And remember to post a comment or question. Your voice matters, and I want to hear from you. The protests that have erupted all over this country in the wake of George Floyd's murder by police in Minneapolis have been described as the largest movement in U.S. history. For more than 10 weeks, protesters from Portland to New Jersey have taken to the streets demanding change. What does that change look like, though? And where does the protest movement go from here? And more importantly, what can today's protesters learn from the civil rights giants of the 1950s and 60s? Let's get at it. Today, joining me is Supervisor Mark Ridley-Thomas, who recently authored a resolution to make Los Angeles the 37th county in the nation to declare racism a public health crisis and to address systemic racism in its policies, practices, and services. I'm going to sit down and talk with Supervisor Ridley-Thomas about what does that resolution mean for the over 11 million residents of LA County. And later in the show, I go one-on-one with legendary civil rights leader, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Welcome to the show, Supervisor Ridley-Thomas.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
You have been on the forefront of fighting for equal justice, civil rights for several decades. And I just want to ask you, when you think about what's happening today in terms of the protest movement, the protests that we're witnessing all over this country and really internationally, all over the globe, what do you think about today's protest movement in relationship to those that you've been a part of really throughout your career?
Well, let me begin by causing us to recall the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who said that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I embrace that. And what we're seeing today is the continuation of struggle. In the Portuguese context, it said a luta continua. The struggle continues. And so this is a remarkable moment without anyone who can deny that. And the issue is the level of energy, the level of intentionality, the level of purposefulness. We want to bend it as effectively as we can toward justice and extend it well beyond what might have been imagined. The language of reimagining what these systems look like is right in front of us, and that's what the anti-racism legislation that I authored is based on.
We're going to talk about that legislation, but I want to stay on this protest movement for a minute, Supervisor Ridley-Thomas, because I had the opportunity to sit down with Melina Abdullah, Dr. Abdullah, and she is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And one of the things that she made so clear and she was really passionate about was that today's protest movement, Black Lives Matter in particular, they don't have a centralized leadership. So there's no one that you can point to and say, this is the leader who is setting the agenda and driving that agenda. When we think back to the 50s and 60s, of course, it's Dr. Martin Luther King. It's great leaders like John Lewis, who recently passed away, C.T. Vivian. And we can identify leaders of that movement. But Dr. Abdullah, she resisted any, parts of there being a centralized leadership in today's protest. So in light of that, how are these protest movements different, given that they don't want a leader and profess not to have a leader?
Well, I think it's still early to know how sustainable that is, but we do know that it has been impactful. Leaders emerge. The charismatic thrust of leadership is undeniable. And at some point, the organization and the execution and the like has to be attended to. And they may have emerged with a new model of movement, but the test is whether it is sustainable. But at this moment in time, there's no denying the fact that it is extraordinarily impactful. It has, in many ways, competed with a pandemic with respect to COVID-19, the issue of movement, the issue of challenging systems, the issue of protest, nonviolent civil disobedience, and calling it out, truth to power, is undeniably moving an agenda of consequence, and that has to be acknowledged and in many ways celebrated.
No doubt about that, Supervisor Ridley Thomas. Clearly, the protest, not just following George Floyd's murder, but the protest movements that we've seen over the last decade have had incredible impact, particularly at the local level. But I wonder, and you mentioned the word sustainability, is there something about this movement that causes you to think that it may not be sustainable?
I don't know successful models that lack leadership in a prominent and focused and centralized way. Otherwise, it's hard to galvanize and organize. But that statement that I just made is at this point in time contradicted by what we see in terms of the impact of what has been brought to bear by virtue of the movements that have emerged. It is my sense that leadership will in fact present itself, and those who feel so inclined will gravitate toward it. And that's when, from a historical perspective, from a sociological perspective, we begin to see splintering. But be that as it may, I believe that we need to exploit, in the best sense of the word, the moment, and push back on policies that emanate largely from the White House that seek to suppress peaceful protests, that seek to suppress voting rights, that seek to deny the basics in the way of persons having access to being counted in the census, that wants to repeal the ACA. All of these issues are packed into what it means to transform this environment that's so desperately needed to do so. And hopefully, if things go as they ought to go, if the arc of the universe is bending toward justice, it will present itself in a fabulous way on November the 3rd, 2020, at the election of a new president. We need a personnel change in the White House, and we need that desperately to move things forward. And it's no denying the fact that some of the energy that we are seeing is situational, is contextual, it is in response to this level of racist policymaking, this level of complete denial and disrespect across the board. And to the extent that that is the case, we have none other than the President of the United States to thank for the level of energy that's going on. In terms of police misconduct and excessive use of force, he's all but sanctioned that. His denial of the fact that African Americans and other persons of color are disproportionately and adversely affected by police policies in terms of the excessive use of force is no more than to stoke the flames of discontent. And therefore, I think we need to stay on the case and push as far as we can with the range of models that we have. I have to say to you, I subscribe to nonviolent direct action. I subscribe to civil disobedience. I subscribe to dialogue. No one model is the perfect model. We have to do all that we can, and people should get in where they fit in to push it forward to make our communities and the nation of which we are part a better place for all of us to live.
You mentioned the word exploit, and you said obviously you meant it in a positive way in terms of taking advantage of this moment where we are to push forward to break down, racial barriers that have plagued this country for centuries. But the word exploit has come up in the protest movement in a different way. We've seen leaders, particularly recently in Portland, the head of the NAACP in Portland has said that some of the white protesters, he used the word spectacle, and they're using terms like exploit, like people are exploiting the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest around racial justice and police reform, kind of hijacking that message. So have you seen that happen in some of the protests happening in Los Angeles? And how do we prevent people who have their own agenda that doesn't have anything to do with racial justice or racial equality? How do we prevent them from hijacking the protests which have led to some of the positive change that you've identified?
Well, I can tell you this is hardly new. Agent provocateurs have dotted the history of legitimate protests for a half century plus. And in the work that we did at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference right here in Los Angeles, it drew forth the Los Angeles Police Department and the Public Intelligence Division of the Police Department, PDID, which was essentially designed to spy. And they were indiscriminate in terms of spying on those who were engaged in unlawful activity versus those who were engaged in lawful activity. So this is not new. Portland is unique. The chair of the Black Studies Department at Portland State makes the point that there is a level of disingenuousness here that doesn't dig deeply enough in terms of the structural problems that African Americans experience in Portland. Portland is unusual in terms of it being 70+% white. You don't find very many cities in America with that profile that's pushing what might be described as a progressive agenda. None of these movements can lay claim to being perfect. The dynamic that happens to take place is they have to be critiqued, they have to be pushed, they have to be checked. And that happens across the board. And that's why you've had over the arc of history so many different movements. You had an SCLC, which was to the left of the NAACP. You had an Urban League that was more centrist in his thrust. You had NCNW representing the interests of women, and the Pullman Porters who understood what labor was about. And they constituted a substantial piece of work. Jesse Jackson, who you will have later, came with PUSH. Al Sharpton came with NAM. And so there's always a variety of ways of getting this work done. And my point of view is if it's legitimate work, then get after it. Marion Wright Edelman with the Children's Defense Fund, still in place, 40 years in, working on behalf of children and trying to say these are they who are the most exploited that we can never forget, and came out of the civil rights movement with freedom schools to say we've got to invest in our future. And so I believe that there are many ways to do this work, and I believe that the phenomenon in Portland is unique, but I also feel like
I want to stop you right there.
Greek is important.
Let me just, you're saying that you think Portland is unique, but what we're seeing, or at least being reported out by the media, is that white supremacists are infiltrating protests, not just in any one city, but in many cities across the country, and that they are, projecting this image that protests are violent. So how do we address, what could be considered, a negative, what is being portrayed is this violence in these protests that really don't have anything to do with the people you just identified who've been out, on the front lines peacefully protesting. But when white supremacists show up, then we see, these negative images that really paint the whole movement in a negative light.
Well, I think the first thing we have to have is a president that knows the difference between a white supremacist and someone who's earnestly pushing for constructive social change. He seems to have an inability to make the distinction, therefore he conflates. I go back to Charlottesville with respect to what happened there. And I think we shouldn't underestimate white supremacists and what they do. They are mobile. Charlottesville being an example, 3 of the persons who were ultimately prosecuted in that context were from Los Angeles. And let me just give you a little indication of their profile. Double degreed from the University of California, engineer background, full-time employees. But they found themselves in Charlottesville engaged in nothing short of violent, provocateur.
Wait, Mr. Supervisor, so are you saying that's the new profile of a white supremacist? We shouldn't be looking for, these boogeymen in closets. These are educated, employed individuals who are on the front lines pushing this racist agenda.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't look for your grandfather's white supremacists. You shouldn't look for those who are in sheets with hoods on their heads. I think the profile of anti-justice forces, Antifa and the like, are in fact much different in profile. And there's a pretty extensive drill down in terms of tracking them. The skinheads and the like in the jails of LA County and other groups, they are frankly under surveillance, but they are busy, very busy, very destructive. And it would be helpful if the President of the United States were to take a stand and call them out for who they are in the interest and protection.
Well, that may be a little challenging because by some accounts, some of the people that work in the White House have been labeled in terms of as being white supremacists because of the attitudes, because of the policies that they advance, because of the racial division that they sow through some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House. So
no debate on that. No debate on that. I mean, you could call him the enabler in chief at that point. And this is essentially why I continue to make the point that a personnel change is critical for the survival and the perfection of democracy.
No disagreement on that. Absolutely. Hoping that all of that energy we're seeing on the streets and protests across the country translates into voting, power and enthusiasm.
Well, that's a big deal because it doesn't always translate. Some take the position that voting is for someone else. We protest and not vote. But then there's a new thrust that's saying protest and then vote. And we see that happening. And I want to salute that. I want to embrace that. I want to celebrate that. Otherwise, if you don't vote on November the 3rd, you have no right to complain on November the 4th. It is essentially a matter of us making sure that we take this power back and use it in the most constructive way that we can.
So Supervisor, you're saying you are seeing, and you're right, protest, and actually what we saw is some of the biggest activists in the 2016 lead up to that election were actually encouraging people not to vote. We're saying that voting didn't matter, that saying that none of the candidates matter, that, Hillary Clinton, we saw how she was maligned by some of the actual protesters who in some ways you would think would have a similar agenda in terms of fighting racism. But you are saying in a hopeful way that you're seeing a difference leading up to this November election, that more of those voices from the streets are actually talking about translating that into voting and electoral politics?
Oh, absolutely. The work with Rock the Vote and related such entities, Color for Change, and the whole network of operatives are completely aligned with protests, but know that it has to translate into public policy in a very direct way, and you have to have people who are engineering that. Build the Bench in New York, made an eloquent statement about that, and that's the demographic to which they are speaking. The President of the United States, at John Lewis's funeral, that is the president with whom we identify, Barack Obama, made it very, very clear that protest is appropriate. It has its place, but protest without exercising the franchise is incomplete, it's truncated, it is bordering on being empty. We've got to seize power in the conventional way and translate it to push forward an agenda for change.
And speaking about agenda for change, Supervisor, I do want to talk to you about the piece of legislation that you authored recently at the end of July, making, first of all, racism a public health crisis, having that declared in the county, joining 36 other counties, cities across this country, but also really making it intentional for LA County, which is one of the biggest counties in the country, to address systemic racism. Why now? Why that piece of legislation? Why now?
If not now, when? The moment is right to look at the 170-year history of the county of Los Angeles and ask, is it not time for a thoroughgoing self-examination? This is the largest county in the nation, as you mentioned earlier, 11 million residents, and it seems to me we have an obligation to represent. It's the third largest population center of African Americans in the United States, and therefore the critical mass of our witness can make a difference. It is not at all irrelevant that Patrice Cullors finds her home here in Los Angeles and has found a way to bear witness with her colleagues in New York. And so Los Angeles brings forth, you cannot ignore 92, that the civil unrest, or prior to that 65. We are a part of a historical narrative that says that justice must be brought to bear. And in fact, that racial justice is at the tip of the discussion in terms of how we make not only Los Angeles better, the state of California, and by extension, the United States of America. A lot goes on in Los Angeles, and I think we're ready, and we need to go deep, not just in terms of implicit bias, but explicit examination of institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism, and take the anti-racist posture that has emerged through more scholarship. We began in 1993 with Professor Cornel West speaking the language of race matters, and we travel all the way to where we are with Ibram Kendi and his new text on anti-racism and pushing forward. And this is a forward march to correct these problems that are not of the past, but they stalk us today in terms of disproportionality, in terms of police violence, disproportionality in terms of COVID-19. And I can go on and on in terms of education, housing, and the like. There is work to be done, and the County of Los Angeles needs to be about that work.
So thank you, one, for your leadership on this issue, Supervisor Ridley Thomas. But what you just said, I think, gives us a glimpse of how overwhelming this problem can be when you talk about tackling systemic racism. What does that look like at a practical level in terms of what will the county do now that is different than what the county did before this piece of legislation was brought forward?
Well, it will be then a priority of the county, one of 8 priorities established to the Office of the Chief Executive Officer. It will project to be staffed. It will then move through all nearly 40 departments in the County of Los Angeles who issued their own statements in light of the realities with which we are contending, and that's from the coroner's office all the way to the Department of Health Services and more. Probation, name the departments, many departments in the County of Los Angeles, Children and Family Services, disproportionate impacts in those contexts. And so it means a drill down, a systematic drill down. And it also means that the department heads will be evaluated on an annual basis as to how far they've come and what specifically they've done. So accountability is key here, and we'll issue an annual report and even more.
But give us an example. So I'm a county department head. I know the county has over 100,000 employees.
Correct.
So I have a department of 5,000 people. Am I going into that department to look at my diversity numbers? What am I looking at? Am I looking at my dollars spent on diverse vendors? Am I looking at my staffing in that department? What am I actually doing on a practical level that someone looking in from the outside can say that this resolution made a difference in terms of addressing systemic racism?
I think you've listed many of the things that they must do, and it depends on the particular department. If it's the Department of Business, if it's the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs, you have to look at procurement in terms of minority-owned and managed businesses and ask, what of the $36 billion budget of the County of Los Angeles and the section of that speaks to procurement, are we prepared to increase? If it's in the Department of Health Services or Public Health, for an example, the question is the health outcomes. If they're disproportionately negative and out of alignment with the general population as relates to African Americans or Latinos, then the question is, what is your equity agenda to correct and try to cause those numbers to move in a different way? What is your cultural competency framework in terms of the number of people on your staff that are moving that agenda? If it's the Department of Children and Family Services, the question is, why such a disproportionate number of African American kids in the foster care system, and what specifically are we doing to address those crises? That's what has to happen. That's what the focus has to be. It cannot be business as usual. It cannot be, this is a mega bureaucracy, the largest of its sort in the entire nation. It has to be that we will self-examine. We will cause different outcomes to present themselves in the interest of a better safety net, in the interest of increasing the quality of life for the people of this region. And by extension, then it moves through the state of California. It means then that we have to take the disproportionate impact in terms of homeless persons in the County of Los Angeles, a county that has 8% of the population being African American and 34% of the homeless population being African American. And the question then is, what do we do to challenge that? What do we do to say we will not accept that? We can do better than that. We can cause this to be a different kind of outcome. And that's why we are doing the analytical work and the implementation work, and it's underway.
And do you see this, Supervisor Ridley Thomas? Obviously the County of Los Angeles has a multi-billion-dollar budget. And when I think about, being able to establish a department or allocate staff to do this kind of deep dive and this rigorous analysis that you just described, I'm thinking about a small county, someplace in Missouri, someplace in Illinois that doesn't have the financial resources that the County of LA has. How can this be a model that can be replicated in other places outside of a place like LA County?
Well, LA County is anomalous. We know that from the beginning. There is no county that has 110,000 employees outside of LA County. There is no county that has a budget of $35 billion. And so we start there. But what we do can set an example, and we transport. For example, when we adopted Measure H, which is our homeless measure, first of its sort in the nation, where we move $355 million annually into homelessness exclusively by virtue of the fact that voters have afforded us that opportunity. People from all over the country, not the least of which was Portland, called and said, can you come and tell us how to do this? And so I think we will be on a mission to demonstrate what we've done and how we've done it, try to transport that and try to contextualize that. That is to say, make it work where you are. And that's what we have an obligation to do. We're committed to doing that work. But the first order of business is for us to better get our act together, get our house in order so that we have something authentic to share.
Well, before I let you go, Supervisor Ridley Thomas, everybody is talking about this big VP pick that is supposed to be announced this week by Joe Biden. He's talked about it extensively. He told us a couple of months ago.
I've told Joe Biden I'm not available, and that's all I can say on the subject.
Well, you know what? You just did us a big favor. You just crossed one person off of this long list because everybody's been guessing. He told us it was going to be a woman, so we at least know the gender of the person he will be selecting.
Correct.
He then told us that there were 4 African-American women that were still, high on this list, but there are other women from, Senator Elizabeth Warren to Governor Whitmer in Michigan. And, according to which paper you read, there's still probably 12 women on this list. I just want to ask you how important, given the work that you've done around justice and equality, and given this moment that we're all talking about that we are in, this moment where we can really push for systemic change, how important do you think it is that Biden picks an African-American to be on that ticket with him?
Well, I think it's very important for a host of reasons. But the most important thing is for Joe Biden to be elected. And the political calculus then is who will increase the likelihood of that happening. The good news is that African-American women...
Right there. Some political analysts say that the VP, is a do no harm, that they don't really add much, that, Biden's poll numbers are already high, even in national poll numbers, as well as in those key swing states, and that the goal should not be to look for someone that can help, but to look for someone who will do no harm. Do you agree with that? You've been in politics, pretty much your entire professional career. Do you think that?
Well, I think that is true. As a student of history, I do think there's value that can be added. Certainly, you start from the baseline of do no harm, but you try to elevate beyond that point. And so it is no question in my mind that the current discussion is a huge level of affirmation in terms of African-American leaders who are women in the political sphere, in the policy sphere. You've named 4 of them, and obviously there are others at the congressional level, at the level of municipal government, a lot going on there. And so it means that African-American women are in play in a significant manner. And my view is that the bottom line is you have to be able to take Donald Trump out. And whoever can maximize that outcome is what Joe Biden needs to be focused on. And that very well could be a message that says that diversity on that ticket with respect to gender and ethnicity is the recipe that will work. And it's certainly what the nation could stand to benefit from. So I'm encouraged by this discussion, and I'm hoping for a favorable outcome in that regard.
You've been elected, Supervisor Ridley Thomas, to multiple offices. You've been a city council member in Los Angeles. You've served in the state legislature as a state rep, as well as a state senator, and then on to the county board of supervisors, which is arguably one of the most powerful positions in the state of California. And by some accounts, with a $35 billion budget, you're more powerful than many of the governors in this state, in this country, who don't have budgets the size of the budget of LA County. So you know a lot about electoral politics for sure. So I wonder, though, we live in California, you live in California, and we're, by some accounts, in what's called a bubble. And, we tend to be on the progressive side, and having conversations about women, and definitely women of color, is something we're very comfortable with, something we promote, and something that, is quintessential Los Angeles. But I'm from the Midwest. I'm from St. Louis, and I have a lot of those Midwestern sensibilities and lots of relatives that still live in the Midwest. And when I talk talk to them, they're not nearly as hopeful about a woman first, and definitely a woman of color being the right way to go in an election that is so critical. There's a lot of fear from 2016, people believing that, we should have won that election, and somehow we end up with this reality star, failed businessman for president. So what do you say to those Midwesterners? I have about 10 seconds. If you could talk to my Midwestern family members who are very anxious about this female and potentially female woman of color, what words of wisdom do you have for them?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you made your way to Los Angeles. And I want to say to you that your Midwesterners ought to follow your lead in terms of your mentality and your openness to a new environment so that the nation can see itself in a new light. This is what is required. We can't do it like we've always done it. And the time is now to make significant change. I think the nation is ready, and we ought to embrace it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Supervisor Ridley Thomas, for those words of advice. And I hope my aunt, Alberta, is listening. And the rest
Come on in, Alberta. Come on in. The water is fine.
Kill me for that. But she's my political buddy. And at 86 years old, she is as astute about politics as any political analyst you see on national television. But again, thank you so much for sitting down with me, Supervisor Ridley Thomas, and continue the great work that you're doing. And you know that your leadership is appreciated.
Thank you very much.
All right, that was Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, and he talked about a new way and the new way that we need to think about this nation. And my next guest has been on the forefront of thinking about new ways to think about this nation. He is a legendary civil rights leader, an activist, a Baptist minister, a former Democratic presidential candidate himself. He began his journey of fighting for civil rights over 5 decades ago. He worked directly with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s and ran for president in 1984 and 1988. In his later presidential bid, he won over 6 million votes. He won 7 primaries and 4 caucuses. He has graced the cover of Time magazine multiple times. Joining me this morning is the legendary
He's being introduced right now.
Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you.
I enjoyed the Mark Ridley, and Mark was he's a very special,
Yeah, I know the two of
he's special. I appreciate Mark very much.
In Los Angeles, he is a treasure to all of us in Los Angeles and the state of California. And I know that the two of you have had an opportunity to work together. So he spoke very fondly of you as well, Reverend Jackson.
I admire him very much.
So I'm just thrilled and elated to be able to sit down and talk with you, Reverend Jackson, particularly in this moment that we are in. You have been on the forefront for the last 5 decades, fighting for civil rights and justice and equality. You've been a part of the most memorable and outstanding protest movement in this country. So I want to ask you first, what stands out for you the most about that period in your life when you were on the front lines?
First one, July 16, 1960, really 60 years ago, July 16, 1960. What stands out to me about the period we're in now, this coming Thursday, July the 6th, August 6th, it's really our July the 4th. First thing, we had the right to vote, frankly. American democracy really is just 55 years old. It's not, we don't use Jefferson, Philadelphia democracy, we use Selma democracy. Jefferson democracy, only white male landowners could vote. Didn't no land, women couldn't, blacks couldn't vote. It was really kind of limited. It was kind of race supremacy, really. Some democracy, blacks could vote. Where women could serve on juries, 18-year-olds could vote. You could vote by on campus. You could vote bilingually. Native Americans could vote. We export some democracy. We'll export Philadelphia democracy. That's the first thing. Second thing is that I think in focusing on John Lewis's survival and what he did during that period, we must appreciate the foundation that Dr. King and John operated from. NWA was born in 1911, in the midst of lynching. The Supreme Court turned us over to segregation masters as opposed to slave masters. 4,000 blacks were lynched between 1880 and 1940, lynching. These lawyers, 2 or 3 at a time, sometimes going in places with dark corners, they stay in people's homes, they couldn't stay in hotels. The 54 decision was a big deal. You have Dred Scott 1857, you have Press Plus 1857, 1896, and you have this decision. It's the foundation of everything. I asked Ms. Paulson, I said, Ms. Paulson, why are you so? I thought about challenging the 54 to see if it were valid. She's a guy named Attorney Fred Gray made it every Wednesday. How do you challenge the 54 decision to test it? It was a test case. And so she responds to Thurgood Marshall. Now the King responds to her with improving the boycott. The Lewis responds to Dr. King. So you must appreciate the legal foundation shifted in 1954, the legal foundation. About time they would do the credit they got, they deserve. John Hope Franklin, his testimony of Kenneth Clark, Black and White Dolls, and proving segregation injured both white and blacks. And Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, Joe Rao, Jack Greenberg. Serious legal work laid the foundation. We're living our faith, live under the law. The next 9 years was struggling, marching, and protesting, going to jail, sitting in, burning buses, and all of that, which John was a leader in that phase of our struggle. But let me submit this to you. In 1963, Dr. King and John Lewis spoke at the March on Washington. That day, from Texas to Florida to Maryland, we couldn't use a single public toilet. Back of buses was standard. We couldn't buy ice cream at Howard Johnson. We couldn't run a room at Holiday Inn. Black and brown soldiers sat behind Nazi POWs American military bases, August 63. 64, public in that indignant, that barbarism, for lack of a better way to put it. 64, Democratic Convention, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party said the white Democrats don't represent us. That was a showdown in Atlanta City that year. Next year, John leads the march across the bridge in Selma, Alabama. My point is, 54 to 65, those 11 years determined everything that flows after that. The right to vote, self-democracy. Again, blacks should vote for the first time. So you look up and see a black man named Montgomery, Selma, in Birmingham. Dr. King never saw a black man in Atlanta, Georgia, for example. He died. There were 2 black men, Dick Hatcher and Carl Stokes in Cleveland. Mark Renner Thomas, who was an NCLC organizer in California, now county commissioner. All this comes in the wake of the 65 decision. This coming through August 6th would be the anniversary of the August 6th decision. It's out July the 4th, really.
And so, Reverend Jackson, when you reflect back on those protest movement and how it resulted in the substantial laws we saw in terms of voting rights and anti-discrimination laws and housing and employment, when you look at today's protest movement, what would you say to these leaders, the protesters, the activists now who are on the streets, who've been on the streets for months? What is the significant policy change that you think can come out of the protests that we are witnessing today?
When you protest, do heavy lifting. There are those in the 60s who try to go on their own and be dismissive of the struggle that had made us possible. They didn't last very long. Mandela and Tambo in South Africa, they hooked in the ANC, they hooked into the main thing. NWA's legal struggles, SCLC, Urban League was the main struggles. Today, this generation must fight for the constitutional right to vote. As a matter of fact, this week, Dick Durbin from Illinois and Ms. Warren put in the legislation to make vote the constitutional right. That's a state's right. Every state has its own deals. 50 states, separate unequal schemes. You end up losing in Florida in 2000 because the Secretary of State manipulated the numbers. brought in prisoners to confuse the process. Bush got 530 vote lead, stopped the count at midnight, 27,000 blacks and uncounted. That wouldn't happen with the constitutional right to vote. In 2016, Hillary won by 3 million votes. Electoral college, I mean, there's no class A and class B stock in voting. She won by 3 million votes. She should be the president. That's a big deal, the constitutional right to vote. In the meantime, we've got to get the Section 5 restored, so when they move in districts and that like, it's dealt with. So that's one thing. The second thing is, every place that a lynching occurred, there should be a marker. That's Brian Stevens' position, Economic Justice Institute in Montgomery. Mm-hmm. We were driven north by terror, driven west by terror. I mean, they burned Tulsa, they burned Rosewood, Florida. They hung us on the states. We were driven north without jobs by terror. That must be unearthed in this season of Revelation.
I want to ask you, Reverend Jackson, you ran for president twice, 1984 and 1988, and you had what considered then to be a very progressive platform. When you look at this upcoming November election, I know that you originally endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders. Are you endorsing Joe Biden?
I support Joe Biden, but let me submit to you, when I ran in 84 and 88, white officials were afraid to endorse me, and so Bernie Sanders did. On our commitment to healthcare, that healthcare is present in every city, healthcare disparities. We need a single-payer healthcare system, and I think it's going to happen this time. And when Elizabeth Warren and Bernie talked about it during the campaign, it was seen as abstract. But now, given COVID-19, everybody must be covered. If you don't cover the driver, you're not covering the driven. The cook, you cover who they cook for. We must have a comprehensive health care. That has to be an agenda item. Health disparities in all these towns. Also, education disparities. Given the fact we're talking about virtual learning and distance learning, black kids don't have computers. Those who can teach computers, they'll be further behind. That's a big deal. Equal access to education. Education is tax-based funded as opposed to intrinsic worth. If you live in an area where the tax-based high, education is good, tax-based low, education is bad. Interesting enough, we do well in football and basketball. It's hard to be the best basketball player, best football player in the world, but the reason we're so good is the playing field is even. Rules are public, rules are clear, we're fair, and school is transparent. We fight for even playing field access to education and computer science and capital industry, technology, and deal flow. Those are our challenges today.
Are you surprised, Reverend Jackson, to see that your platform, which was considered to be really radical back in the 80s, has now in many ways been embraced by the current day Democratic Party around things like universal health care, single payer, around criminal justice reform, reducing sentencing for nonviolent drug charges? So many of the things that were part of your platform in the 1980s have now become very acceptable and being embraced by today's Democratic Party. Does that surprise you?
Well, no, neither party supported free Mandela. And it's just all over America because we consider Mandela a terrorist. South Africa was our ally. So Mandela was on the terrorist list up in 1996 after he'd been out of jail and had been elected president. So free Mandela was considered radical. It was not, it was just basic human basic rights for all people. And so I'm delighted to have lived long enough to see the voting rights going to the Senate this week as constitutional right. That's a big deal. It's a big deal.
Yes.
They have comprehensive health care based upon sickness. That's a big deal. To stop the flow of drugs in our community, the flow of guns. You know, the right to bear arms is constitutional right. The right to vote is not a constitutional right. We must clean up all of this. I'm excited to see it happen.
And you talked about living long enough, Reverend Jackson. So you know that Joe Biden has made a commitment to make a woman his running mate. And this week, we are likely to learn who that woman is. He also told us recently that there are 4 African-American women who are at the top of his list of consideration. What are your thoughts about, this won't be the first time that a Democratic candidate has chosen a woman. We had Geraldine Ferraro, but this might be the first time that an African-American woman is on the ticket for VP. Any thoughts about
that? Ferraro, she just came out of our campaign. We argued in '84. If India going to head India, and Golda Meir could head Israel, and you could have the woman headed Britain at the time. A woman would be president. We kept arguing that case. Well, we were not willing to vote for me at that time. They liked that part of it. So, we raised it so high, the mother had to choose a woman, Geraldine Ferraro. That was a byproduct of our work in 1984. But now you look at those who are up for consideration. You have Kamala Harris, U.S. Senator from California. One of the richest Americans in California. That's a big deal. She brings to the table vote getting ability. You look at Susan Rice. Her capacity as a foreign policy leader is in the highest echelon. That of Congresswoman Bass, her Speaker of the House of California. I mean, these are high-level women, and one of them will be on the ticket. Another should be in the Attorney General. Another should be in the Supreme Court. I mean, these women all have significant roles in the next government.
In total agreement with you on that, Reverend Jackson. And as a Black woman and as a mother of 2 Black daughters, I am just thrilled that African-American women, as you said, high caliber African-American women are being considered by Joe Biden for his running mate.
He cannot choose a Secretary of State superior to Susan Rice, for example, in terms of background experience. A woman with more credentials, in some sense, than Kamala in terms of her vote-getting ability. And one of the 10 Americans in California, that's it. But now, whenever you choose, the big deal now, it seems to me, is somebody must be able to pull the South. We can win a Senate seat in North Carolina, Black guy, in South Carolina, Mississippi, Colorado. Whoever's on the ticket must be able to pull enough votes in those to turn red states blue or turn them purple.
Who do you think on the list that he's considered has the ability to do that, to help him pull the South, Reverend Jackson?
Well, I don't want to say, I don't want to get in the crossfire of the endorsement because all of them are so qualified. I would want to say anything here today that would diminish the option to be on the ticket. All the well qualified to be on the ticket. Just like President Barack picked up Biden and put him on the ticket. Black women put Biden on their shoulders, took him across the country. So he should put one on his ticket. He's humbly doing the right thing, I support Joe Biden in that effort.
And I appreciate that, Reverend Jackson. You're right. This has become quite a dogfight, and there are lots of articles now about, infighting amongst these women. And I hope the party, and I know the party will be able to heal. You mentioned the South. I also wonder about the progressives, because the progressives, have become a big voting bloc within the Democratic Party. So when you think about how the party heals after this election, the selection of a VP candidate, how do we make sure that we bring the progressives into the fold, and that we don't see some of the fissures that we saw in the 2016 election with respect to the progressives? Is there any particular candidate that you think that bill?
60 African Americans in the Congress now, led by people like Congressman Maxine Waters, is an able leader. 60 blacks, 40 Latinos, 20 Asians, 2 Native Americans. That's the heart of the progressive movement. So I'm convinced when this is over, you'll choose one of those persons. If you choose one, another can be Secretary of State, another can be Attorney General. I mean, it's not like they have to go from without to oblivion. These women are well qualified to have run their government.
Right. There's lots of room in Biden's cabinet. And I'm so glad you said that, because it's not just the one job as VP, but it is the diversity, both gender and race, that we are so excited about when we think about Joe Biden.
And that's why you can't just focus on Joe Biden himself, in the sense that between the negative ads that run on Joe Biden between now and November, you could be turned off by a given ad, but don't do that. Bottom up. The Congress is at stake. The Senate is at stake. Judges at stake. Police chiefs are at stake. So that go voting bottom up, but don't just go top down. Why should an 18-year-old vote for Pell Grants? Why should college students vote? Student loan debt reduction. I mean, we have many reasons to vote, none not to.
No, and absolutely, you're right, Reverend Jackson. It's not just about the president. It's about flipping the Senate. It's about maintaining the House. It's about state houses, and local elections, we know, are incredibly significant. I want to ask you about Donald Trump. You've known Donald Trump for many, many years. Are you surprised by how he is governing as president, or is this what everybody should have expected given his history?
Well, we didn't expect this, and we started the Rainbow Push Wall Street Project, Mark William Thomas brought that 20-some years ago. And he came to the meeting with President Kennedy, with President Clinton, a kind of New York businessman, liberal type. We had no idea he was masking to be who he has become. He's become a real serious right winger. I mean, Charlottesville. So the Mexican judge cannot be judicious. African and the Caribbean assholes. Babies born about it. We have never known. Now he's considering not giving any people who wins. He may just trust in the White House past January 20th and take him out bodily as drama. So be very aware that he is in some very dangerous waters right through here.
Yeah, Reverend Jackson, one of the things that he has done, obviously, so divisive on so many levels, but even with regards to this VP pick, running ads suggesting that, somehow Latinos or Latinx women are being left out of this calculation by Joe Biden, and he's only favoring African-American women. So again, trying to sow division between Latinx women and African-American women. I want to ask you, though, how as a country do we fight back against this divisive president? He has the bully pulpit. He's able to get on television every day, masquerading with these coronavirus task force briefings that are really campaign rallies where he gets to sow more of that kind of divisive rhetoric. How do we fight back against Donald Trump?
He will not have it long. That's the good news. Second news is that we have the right to vote. We didn't always hope for change. Now we in fact have the power to vote for the next president and determine the next president. And the Supreme Court, the Congress, House, and Senate, we have that power. So I said, keep your eyes on the president. Don't be diverted by. He manipulates the media through Twitter. He says the cows of the moon, the rest of those cows and moons. He's I'm saying focus on voter registration,
right,
census, and voter suppression. Voter registration, census, and voter suppression.
Oh.
Those three things must matter the most. Whatever he says, he won't have much longer to say it. We vote our hopes and not our fears.
Oh, from your lips to God's ears. Absolutely, Reverend Jackson. I just want to ask you before I get out, you've done so much. Your body of work is so expansive. We cannot think of a moment in the fight for civil rights, over the last 50, 60 years, as you just said, that doesn't include you being involved, being, on the front lines, being a leader in this movement. When future generations read about Reverend Jesse Jackson, what is it that you would want them to say and to know? And quite simply, what do you want your legacy to be for future?
I joined the movement. I never stopped serving. John Lewis joined the movement. he joined it. I keep saying the body of legal work done by NAA Legal Defense Law from 1954 was the foundation of everything we did. You could be a good lawyer and lose in 53. You could poor lawyer win in 55 when the law changed. Matter of fact, before the Monroe bus boycott, the big deal was in 56 when they ratified the 54 decision. Once the 56 legal decision was won, then buses started changing all over America because the legal foundation. Don't forget the work of Thurgood Marshall and Joe Rao and Jack Greenberg, Constance Baker Motley. They played a huge role in Attorney Matthew Perry. We live in our faith, we live under the law. They changed the law. And then it took us 9 years to unravel the chokeholds that Southern Jim Crow had on the culture. I remember in Greenville, South Carolina, I never saw a black policeman. I was 20 years old. No black police, no black firemen. Blacks couldn't sell clothes downtown. No blacks in the school board. We were living under Democratic tyranny. Tyranny. But the fact of the matter is, we won the battle. Yeah. Now you look at Johnson speaking to the 64 Civil Rights Congress. Looked like a 17th century textile show, all white men. Now you have, when Maxine Waters speaks, Wall Street has to listen.
All right.
When the Congresswoman Edith Johnson from Texas speaks, Silicon Valley said, we've never had this much representation of political power before in our lives. Mm-hmm. Use this power and expand upon it. In many ways, these are bad times, the best times for us. We've never had this much power in American democracy.
Right. Final thoughts, Reverend Jackson. How do you want us to, again, future generations, how do you want them to remember you?
Well, that's your problem. I serve every day. You know, today, for example, the big focus is on the Democratic Convention in August. And we're honored when it starts by the Black Caucus Democrat Party. I'm glad about that, the work we've done. But in sister, and I ran native for something called Winner Take Off. I got 47% of the vote. The opposition got 49, they got 100 votes. We challenged that. Maxine Waters and Willie Brown, we challenged that. And by 88 is proportionality. On 84 rules, Hillary Clinton was a beat Barack. She won California, Ohio, Texas, New Jersey, and New York. On 84, we changed the rules to make it more fair. He would win, she would win, but she could only win what she won. She couldn't get his votes. Right. So changing the rules in 88 to lay the groundwork for 08, that is significant to me. Bringing Americans home from foreign jails, using the moral authority of civil rights movement in America is significant to me. The good news is, with the help of God, I've kept running and I've never stopped fighting. And every day of my life, I keep my hopes alive.
Well, I think that says it all, Reverend Jackson. We will remember you for never giving up on the fight, for always serving, and for keeping hope alive. Thank you so much, Reverend Jackson, for sitting down with me. Continue for many, 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 many more years, the great work and the service that you have been providing for this country. We owe so much to you and are so grateful for your leadership.
Take care of Mark Ridley Thomas.
I will. You have my word on that. I will take care of Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, soon to be City Council member Mark Ridley Thomas.
My.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jackson. The best to you.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you. Well, okay, keep hope alive. What an incredible way to remember the legendary civil rights leader, Reverend Jesse Jackson. I want to thank him for sitting down with me during this critical time. So much is going on. So to have an opportunity to sit down and pick the brain of one of this nation's historical leaders who's been on the fight for justice is really been my pleasure. And Lots of thanks to my good friend, Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas. We've been working together here in Los Angeles on so many of the issues that you hear about in the news, from health equity to childhood sex trafficking. I've had the privilege of working along with him on those really important issues. I want to thanks again to all of you for joining us. Such a inspiring conversation with these two leaders. A big shout out today to my production team for making this interview and making this show happen, because it's really a special show for me as a civil rights leader. Whenever I get to sit down with historical figures, it's such a pleasure for me. We're going to continue this conversation about race and about how we move this nation forward. So continue to follow me at Areva Martin. I just have a couple of words I want to leave you with. John Lewis, and you heard Mark Ridley Thomas talk about John Lewis. You heard Jesse Jackson talk about Congress member John Lewis in his powerful eulogy and service last week. I was so moved by everything that was said, and also by this powerful op-ed that he wrote in the New York Times, that he was so strategic. He told them not to publish it until the day of his funeral. And in that article, he said that ordinary people could redeem the soul of this nation by getting into what he called good trouble. And he said voting and participating in the democratic process were key. Jesse Jackson, as you can tell from that interview and from his life's work, he spent a lifetime getting into that good trouble that John Lewis talked about. From his early days as the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to his days as an activist at Operation Push, Jesse Jackson has made his life's work to fight for the equalities of others. And he talked about staying focused, keeping our eye on the prize, remembering the importance of voting and turning this protest and passion that we see in the streets into electoral politics, and for once and for all, taking back this nation and really making the rights of everybody, not just Black people, but with Latin people, Asian Americans, Native Americans, making everybody a part of this American fabric. So I want to thank again Jesse Jackson for his leadership and for his work. I want to thank Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas again, and thanks to all of the civil rights leaders who continue to really put their lives on the line so that people like me, a little Black girl from a poor neighborhood in North St. Louis, can go to Harvard, become a civil rights lawyer. It's because of leaders like Jesse Jackson. Y'all be safe out there, and remember, we are all in this together.